Hey, what's up, guys? This is Brian from Whisper Status 74. You were looking at Shadow Warrior 2, which was the first HDR title on PC, and it was one of the few games that really started the what is HDR in games. I know I said that was my last HDR video of Devil May Cry. I'm still waiting for the return of Digital Foundry did a PC analysis today, and I reached Alex on Twitter and is getting back to me later tonight to explain the HDR profile for me. I've gone back and forth with it, but I figured I'd load this up just to show you. Now, HDR is not quite as visible in, obviously on YouTube, not yet anyway, and you can see how the picture will change. Because I think a lot of us really do believe that HDR is all about vibrancy and bright colors and more color. In reality, it's more about blending things together. In terms of, well, it's different on every implementation, but a lot of times you guys are finding HDR to be either super saturated and super vibrant. When it's done well, it actually looks more natural. Horizon Zero Dawn, Spider-Man, Forza Horizon 4, it looks more natural with HDR on, and it looks more cartoony with HDR off, which would be counterintuitive because we believe HDR to be more saturated and brighter, when in reality it's actually a dimmer image. We're going to go natural. We're going to do it right here live. You'll see how the screen changes. That was HDR. This is HDR off, by the way. So it's very colorful, very bright. Okay, which means the backlight and everything is on how I set my PC to. We're in game mode. Backlight's at 30. Nothing is on. That's going to make the picture any different than its natural default. Go into... all these games should have what this game has, which is in the settings to just enable HDR. There it is. Back out. Now you saw that the screen flashed green for a second. Change color space. It's not as bright. But what it is it looks more realistic. Let's run it again. Now this time I'm going to pause it so you can go right into it when I'll skip all the changing. You actually see what it looks like. And just to double check, there's HDR. Okay, so I'm going to pause it and I'll transfer it here so for you it's seamless. HDR off. So what's funny is a lot of you think this is what HDR looks like because of the vibrancy, because of the pop. So what I hear about Devil May Cry 5 is that it's HDR because of how bright it is and how saturated the colors are and how much the pop is, when a lot of times in reality it's just a more natural image. Let's do it again. We're going to pause it. And what you have is a more realistic, more natural image. The colors are realistic looking. But if I was to ask you which you thought was HDR, a lot of you would thought the first image was HDR because of the spectral highlights, because of the punch of the image. But this image looks more seamless. The sky, the clouds, the sun. But from what you've been sold on HDR was that it was going to be more vibrant, not dull. Now some of you might see this looks dull. When you give it a few minutes, you realize this actually looks real. Once more. HDR off. Now if you look up in the sky, the sun is not as visible. It just kind of blends together. His fingers aren't as detailed. But most of you would think that this was HDR. And I think a lot of you with your games, especially those of you where your displays aren't quite as bright, as soon as you put HDR on, you're thinking to yourself, what the hell? Why is it dim? It's too dim. Especially when I first played Last of Us and some other titles. Let's do it once more and you'll see the sun is more detailed and it looks more natural. Now, I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying you guys might like this image better. Now as I look here, the sun is actually more detailed. It doesn't show up on screen, unfortunately. But there's more of a haze, but again, it's a more natural image. And I think what they intended on this part of the game. But you better believe that when I first played this game, I actually thought that HDR was broken. And if you watch videos on this title, when they first show HDR implementation, it's super saturated, crazy saturated. Now we'll do it live again and watch how bright the screen gets in the options right here. It's going to blind you. Boom. So if HDR is more color, why does it seem less colorful? Well, I think it's quite the opposite. There's more color in the other image. There's just more gradients. There's more nuance to color. Instead of just being white, there's peach. There's different levels of color. Again, look at his fingers. Look how detailed. See, there's a lot of blooming happening. Pause it again. That oversaturation is gone and his fingers are actually more detailed. So we talk about if we use HDR, if it's not a natural implementation and it's oversaturated, instead of gaining details, fine details, we end up losing them with all the extra saturation and bloom that maybe wasn't intended. And that's kind of the issue that we focus on when we force it on or when it's on and it's not supposed to be on. For Devil May Cry, I'm going to have to wait to hear what Alex from Digital Foundry tells me in regards to the profile. He did not bring it up in his video. And actually no one has brought it up in their PC analysis other than saying it doesn't have a profile. A lot of you guys are saying it is HDR. I can't tell. I think it looks better without it, to be honest. But we're gonna have to wait a few days. I'm not picking up the Xbox version to see what it looks like there. But that's just a quick example of what HDR HDR looks like. I'm not sure how well it's gonna show up on the camera. It should look different, but while this looks more dull, in reality, this is a more realistic image than the very colorful HDR off, which again is a lot of what we think is HDR. Because the marketing behind HDR, even in film, was always about bright, almost a dynamic contrast. That's how it was sold. It was sold to us as a vivid mode. It wasn't sold to us as color space. If you really think about the marketing behind HDR, that was really how it was sold to us. I mean, would you have bought HDR if they said more natural image? Chances are no. If they showed you these before and afters, you probably would have been like, hell no, I'm keeping the brightest image I possibly can. And that's kind of the misconception that so many of us struggled with, especially the first year with HDR, was what looked better. The bright, saturated image or the more natural, dim, even sometimes washed out image. If this is supposed to be morning or, you know, dusk or dawn, that's going to show up. In the other HDR off image, it doesn't show up. This is in the beginning of the game. This is HDR on. We'll turn it off. You see the oversaturation. Once more. But if I flip them around, you would have guessed that HDR was the other video. Or I'm sorry, the other picture, considering that that's the more vibrant one. So when we talk about it, you know, in Resident Evil or in the new Devil May Cry 5, when you're telling me that Devil May Cry 5 is much more vibrant and has much more punch in HDR, you can see why I might be concerned. Because in reality, it's a more natural image. So that's a quick HDR on-off comparison. I hope it shows up on camera. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.